Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20603 in the name of Eileen Campbell on Holocaust Memorial Day 2020, 75th anniversary. Can I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on Eileen Campbell to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to the members who will be supporting this important government motion, enabling a full debate as this Parliament stands together to mark Holocaust Memorial Day and the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it is an important anniversary. Of course, it marks the significant passage of time that has elapsed since that moment of liberation. But it also reminds us that the numbers of those around the world with direct lived experience of that hellish extermination camp are fewer, and that the opportunity for survivors, as the world united yesterday to mark Holocaust Memorial Day to bear witness, was crucial. It's crucial because the message of suffering, pain, trauma and of human cruelty must never ever be forgotten. Those testimonies that were broadcast around the world yesterday from Auschwitz, testimonies that have been published in news reports, that are on social media, powerfully remind us of the human impact of the Holocaust. The lives cut short, the potential unfulfilled, families ripped and torn apart, and the courage and bravery of those who survived and who seek to ensure that that suffering informs a better future for everyone. We must also remember the dark void of the untold stories, stories that will never be told, and the darkness that we do not know about. As Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel reminds us, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. So it is important to remember those human stories of survival, and to also remember and respect all those who didn't, because in so many ways the numbers associated with the Holocaust are unimaginable. 17 million people were executed during the Holocaust. 6 million of them were executed simply because of their faith and because they were Jewish. This unspeakable persecution by the Nazis also included gay people, disabled people, Gypsy and Roma people, and anyone else who was viewed as different.
Bear with me a moment, Cabinet Secretary. Bear with me, it's not a problem for you. I think if we could have the sound up a little, some members are not hearing clearly. So I don't know how you do it, but let me know if you still can't hear. Thank you.
In Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was one of 6 camps built explicitly for the purpose of extermination, 1.1 million people lost their lives, most of whom were Jewish. Massive numbers that give us a sense of the scale of this cynical mass murder, but require to be remembered alongside the personal testimonies and stories so that we never remain unconnected to this dark moment of history. And as the years go by, as new anniversaries of the Holocaust are marked, and as lived memory of the Holocaust fades, it makes the work to know, understand, and to connect to the past all the more vital. Ensuring that in the process we educate our young people about compassion and respect so that they can emerge into their adulthood as responsible and compassionate individuals able to contribute positively to our society. And it's for this reason that the Scottish Government continues to support the work of the Holocaust Educational Trust and their Lessons from Auschwitz project, which is an incredibly powerful way for young people to gain insight into the horrors of the Holocaust and, just as importantly, to learn about why it happened. The programme has enabled almost 5,000 students and teachers from across Scotland to take part and to visit Auschwitz. And I had the privilege of joining them on one of their trips in November last year. I joined students from around Scotland, including some who attend schools in my own constituency. And just last week, I met with Carluke High School pupils Nikita Stevenson and Caitlin Woodhead to reflect on the trip, the impact it has had, and the continued relevance of ensuring the Holocaust is never forgotten. It is an intense trip that begins by describing what life was like in Europe and Poland at that time. Communities made up of different faiths living together as neighbours, as customers, as friends and as colleagues. The destruction of this caused by vilifying, othering, stigmatising and blaming social ills on those of Jewish faith or simply for being different was a deliberate build-up of the strategic effort to exterminate a race. While what went on in the extermination camps should never be forgotten, the context and systematic racism which led to the Holocaust must also be heeded. And when I spoke with Nikita and Caitlin, it was clear that this shared experience of what we saw at the camp will remain indelibly in our minds for the rest of our lives. The mountains of the prisoners' personal items on display, spectacles, combs, shaving tools, hairbrushes, reminding us of the normal everyday actions and needs of the people sent to the camps that are still so familiar for us today. I saw the piles of suitcases with names and addresses carefully written on them of those taken by train to Auschwitz as though they would at some point get them back. I saw the crutches, the calipers, the medical devices and aids of those that were vulnerable and deemed to be of no use to the Nazi regime. And I saw the shoes, piles and piles of shoes worn by the prisoners which would step no more through life's journey. Some shoes were beautiful, red and with heels that suggested times of enjoyment, of fun, dancing, and a life wanting to be lived. And painfully, shoes of the children and of the tiny feet that had made their first tentative steps in life, but which led ultimately to a cruel and fatal end. And then we saw the mountains of hair, pigtails, plaits, and curls, all shorn from the heads of the prisoners in an attempt to further dehumanise them, and then bundled up like sheep's fleece. Seeing all of this alongside the terrifying scale and efficiency of the camps specifically designed to kill more and more, quicker and faster, was impactful and overwhelming. And for the ambassadors I spoke to, life-changing as well. Nikita, before her trip, wanted to study law because it interested her. Caitlin wanted to be a nurse. Following the trip, Nikita wants to practice human rights law and defend against human rights abuses and speak up for intolerances. Caitlin wants to specialise in mental health nursing to help people cope with trauma. Now, these are just two stories of two young women whose profound experience and determination to never forget the Holocaust and to do all they can to build a better future for them and others is one of hundreds of stories of lives impacted by this trip and their passion to work to create a better world. And that's why this trip is so important. It ensures the story is never forgotten, but it also instructs and ensures the next generation understand that their actions matter and that their passions, their commitment and acts can make a difference. Those two inspiring young women from Carluke, I know, will go on to positively impact on the lives of the most vulnerable and will always be guided by the lessons that they learned at Auschwitz. But the sad truth is that the Holocaust did not spell the end of suffering caused by prejudice, and the lessons of the past have not been globally heeded. Last year marked the 25th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide and the 40th anniversary of the end of genocide in Cambodia. And this year also marks the 25th anniversary of the start of the atrocities in northern Bosnia. It was just 25 years ago that rebel Bosnian Serb forces carried out an act of genocide that claimed the lives of over 8,000 Bosniaks and tortured and raped many more because of their ethnicity. And it seems unthinkable that such atrocities could happen during our lifetime, let alone on a continent that we share. And it is a stark reminder of the fragility of our world that at any time and in any place, peace, progress and tolerance cannot be taken for granted. They need to be worked for, cherished and promoted. And whilst we reflect on the devastating and terrifying consequences of these genocide, atrocious human rights violations are still happening in the world right now. In 2018, we saw an ordinary day of worship turned into a day of fear which was felt across the world with the attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And again last year when the hundreds of innocent people were massacred in Christchurch, New Zealand and in Sri Lanka. We must reflect on the division that we are increasingly seeing in our world today. And we must remember that these perpetrators were not born to hate. They were ordinary people with mothers, fathers, siblings and friends who learned to hate, who were drawn into particular ideology that called for the death and the suffering of people that they believed are not like them. And although Scotland is an open and inclusive nation, we are unfortunately not immune to hatred or prejudicial attitudes. We must not permit the creep of complacency, and we must remain vigilant in calling out discrimination, racism and hatred when we see it, both here and globally. And that's why Holocaust Memorial Day's theme of Stand Together is so important. It highlights that we need to work together if we are to build safe, resilient and inclusive communities. We can't tackle hatred and prejudice alone, we must do so together, united. Tackling hate crime and prejudice remain a priority for this government. And in June 2017, we published an ambitious programme of work to tackle hate crime and build community cohesion. As part of this, we adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which reflects the value we place on tackling anti-Semitism and sends a strong message that we believe anti-Semitism to be entirely unacceptable in Scotland. We also recently consulted on adopting a definition of Islamophobia, and we're currently considering the responses to that. Now, there's absolutely no place in Scotland for any form of hatred that makes our communities feel insecure or threatened in their daily lives, and we'll continue to work tirelessly to tackle hatred and prejudice in any way that we can. While this corner of Scotland might be many hundreds of miles away from Auschwitz, and while the sands of time pass, what must not pass or seem distant is our ability to remember and to never forget. But we must also remember with a resolve to learn from that past and to act to build a world free of hatred and of intolerance, and to be heartened by the stories of courage and bravery of those who chose not to be indifferent, but fought for freedom, fought for liberty, and chose to save lives and offer hope. People like Jane Haining, the only Scottish missionary officially recognised as a Holocaust hero, honoured by Yad Vashem as righteous among nations, for saving the lives of Jewish girls, who paid the ultimate price for her bravery in Auschwitz 75 years ago. And we must also be inspired by a new generation who are determined to use their learning found through the work of the Holocaust Educational Trust to contribute to a better future for everyone, regardless of who you are or where you're from. Now, I'm proud to be here in the Chamber today. Our collective presence here, politicians from all parties, represents a powerful and unified display of the type of country and world that we want to be part of. Respect, compassion, love, kindness, those should be the hallmarks of our modern world that challenges hate and the practice of othering. We are here to say that we will not forget, that we will always remember, and that we do so with a commitment to act relentlessly for a better world. So thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I now call Ruth Davison. Ms Davison, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and thanks too to the Government for bringing forward this debate on government time rather than in members' business. Every year we mark Holocaust Memorial Day, and every year by definition the Holocaust slips further into history. This year marks 75 years since the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, and I defy anyone to have watched the news last night and seen hundreds of survivors, children then and bent back in old age now, gathering beyond the Arbeit macht frei gates, possibly for the last time, and not be moved by it. Their numbers have thinned, their voices grow fewer, but for all the passing of time, it seems to me that there has seldom been a year in my lifetime when the lessons of the Holocaust have felt this fresh, this prescient, and this urgent. The rise of hate crime, the politics of identity, culture wars, and out-and-out anti-Semitism we see across the world is a reminder that progress isn't irreversible. Things don't just get better. Injustice and prejudice must be fought. Gains are hard won, and ground will never be held if complacency and indifference are allowed to take hold. Recent anti-Jewish attacks in major European cities and the mainstreaming of anti-Semitic hate speech at home has left our own Jewish population wary and even frightened. A couple of years ago, I did an event for the Board of Deputies in London, and I asked about the groups of men that were in clusters of 4 at every corner and at every entrance to the venue. And I was told that they were volunteer security, the same men taken from the ranks of a community who feels the urgent need to protect their places of worship round the clock from attack and debasement, and their congregations from intimidation and threat. This is happening in our country now to a community still scarred by those events 75 years ago, when 6 million of the Jewish people were systematically annihilated. Following the liberation of the death camps at the end of the Second World War, a horrified public came together to say never again. And yet, again happened, whether in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, or Darfur. In every case, the world failed. We turned our face away, and when finally forced to look and accept, we pledged again that this was to be the last time that systematic annihilation on the basis of ethnicity would be allowed to unfold, until the next. Unlike many in this chamber, I've never been to Auschwitz, but I have been to places of mass murder. Bergen-Belsen, the Racak massacre site in Kosovo, the UN enclave in Srebrenica in Bosnia, where the blue helmets stood aside for Serb forces to sweep in and once again perpetrate genocide on Europe's soil. There is something arresting about each of these places. The stillness where so much indifferent violence and perfunctory murder took place. I wonder at the coincidence of Holocaust Memorial Day being so close to Burns Night, when the most appropriate observation of human capacity for evil is so perfectly captured by Burns himself. Man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn. Yet to mourn is not enough. We must resolve to do better. We have asked too much of those who escaped death at Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, Treblinka, and a dozen other camps, who through luck, guile, fate, or timing avoided the gas chambers, the firing squads, punishment beatings, or rampant disease that claimed the lives of so many. Yet after walking out of hell, we then asked them to relive it. The Holocaust Education Trust's work, both taking children to the camps themselves and having camp survivors tell their stories again and again in classrooms across the country, has been invaluable in teaching generations untouched by such horror how hate can degenerate into evil. That Kristallnacht, or the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, or cattle trucks rumbling into factories of death, are not events in isolation. They are not the alpha and omega. Rather, they are the destination reached from a journey that starts with intolerance, moves to discrimination, traverses hate, ideology, dehumanization, persecution, and then annihilation. All that is required for that journey to be made is for decent people to avert their eyes, to stand back, to leave it to someone else, to be too afraid to challenge in case those instruments of hate are turned on them. That's how it was in 1930s Europe, and it's how the world has turned ever since. We have to take responsibility for the protection of our fellow citizens and for the preservation of the culture of openness, opportunity, diversity, and freedom that so many fought so hard to secure. Soon, the number of survivors will thin to nothing, and those first-hand accounts will cease. But their names will not be lost, nor their stories become untold. Not as long as we commit to that task. In the Talmud it says, "If you lift the load with me, I will be able to lift it. And if you will not, I won't lift it." Tackling those forces of evil, prejudice, hate, and persecution, along with the handmaidens of indifference, blindness, and cowardice which allow them to flourish, is the load that we have left to the survivors of Auschwitz for too long, to the Holocaust Education Trust for too long, to other people for too long. If we want history to be remembered, if we want the names of those who died and those saved to be written, recorded, seen, and to count, then it is time for us, for all of us, to step forward and help lift the load with them. I support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Davison. I call on Polly McNeill from Labour. Ms McNeill, please.
Scottish Labour fully supports the motion, and I thought the very powerful speech of the Cabinet Secretary, and if I may say, a stunning and brilliant speech by Ruth Davidson. And I think it's one of these speeches I think that people should read afterwards. But I'm proud to stand together with other parties in support of this motion today, because this year marks the 75th anniversary since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi death camp. With only 7,000 of the 1.1 million prisoners that passed through its gates still alive when the concentration camp was liberated, 6 million Jews murdered, a third of the world's Jewish population, and there were other victims too. The Roma, ethnic Serbs, Poles and gay people were amongst those who were murdered. It was a genocide of the highest order. And although the motion relates to the anniversary and the liberation of Auschwitz itself, as Ruth Davidson has said, it will be appreciated that there are many, many other extermination and concentration camps. Treblinka in Poland, where 800,000 died. Belzec, where 600,000 also died. Waiting to be sent to their death, many people starved and they died of disease or deliberately worked to death. I do applaud the government for using their time in this important debate. It is painful to read, and it is painful to learn about humanity's worst period in history and the evil humankind is capable of, but it's up to us to mark it in this way. In Adam Tompkins' debate last year, also a brilliant speech, I mentioned that I visited Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland on the very last day of 2018. When people arrive, the guide will ask you not to take the photographs, and the Cabinet Secretary talks about what she saw. The personal effects of shoes and cases. It's a very sharp and pointed message. Not to take a photograph is because each and every shoe, each and every personal belonging is an individual person with their own individual story as how they arrived at this dreadful place. Accounts from brave survivors who escaped to tell the world their stories are everything to us, because without them we could not begin to get our heads around the horror of what happened. How it could have happened at all is the imperative question for any person who is interested in truly ensuring that it could never happen again. And that is why that the Holocaust Memorial Trust is a vital organisation. Its purpose to remind us not only of the 6 million Jews who were brutally murdered, but of how it could have been allowed to happen in the first place. We must educate every child of these facts, these sad facts. No generation can be left out. We must have robust policies in tackling hatred and prejudice of any group in society to translate what it means in today's world, whether it's demonising gypsy travellers or tackling attacks on synagogues, churches, temples or mosques. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, hatred of any kind must be central to the government's work, and I believe that it is. But we must, as political leaders, stand together and unite against hatred to build a better society. Also said by Cabinet Secretary and Ruth Davidson, there are fewer and fewer survivors every year, and in not the too distant future there will be none. And the generations that live on will be the ones who carry the responsibility of relaying those accounts to future generations so that it is never forgotten. And even that is not enough. The Holocaust must be a strong feature in our minds for the future as leaders and politicians. The message of that cannot fade. It cannot be allowed to fade. John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, British philosopher, said, "Let not anyone pacify his conscience by the delusion that he can do no harm if he takes no part and forms no opinion. Bad men need nothing, do nothing more to compass their ends than good men should look on and do nothing." Amongst the many heroes was Eileen Sandler. I wanted to talk about the work that she did as a Polish social worker who saved 2,500 Jewish babies and children from the Warsaw Ghetto and placed them with Polish families. The ghetto had been set up to segregate the city's 380,000 Jews who were sent to death camps. She worked in the Warsaw Health Department and had permission to enter the ghetto. Irina and a small team of social workers smuggled the children out by hiding them in ambulances, taking them through the sewer pipes and on underground passageways, wheeling them out in a trolley or suitcases or boxes. And she noted the names of all the children on cigarette papers and sealed them in 2 glass bottles, which she buried in a colleague's garden. And after the war, the bottles were dug up and their list handed to Jewish representatives. Attempts were made to reunite children with their families, but most, unfortunately, had perished. The Kinder Transport was organised shortly before the war to rescue Jewish children living in Germany and other parts of occupied Europe. And the UK took nearly 10,000 children, nowhere near enough, but those children were placed in British foster homes. One of them is well known to you all and certainly well known to me, and that is the wonderful Alf Dubs, who is a refugee and has done amazing work in the United Kingdom on the question of refugees. The British government supported and publicised the programme. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we know that in times of crisis and war there are innocent civilians and their lives are threatened, and I think we should always assess our role as a country in providing safe passage for refugees, as we have done and argued for, who through no fault of their own are caught up in a conflict which we may well have made the decision to participate in. Britain and Scotland should play a positive role in today's refugee crisis We should live up to our responsibilities and create a humane society to do our part to make the world a better place, if nothing else, in memory of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms McNeill. I now call on Ross Greer for the Green Party. Mr Greer, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As others have mentioned, I'm grateful for the opportunity to mark Holocaust Memorial Day in Parliament and for a full afternoon to have been allocated to it this year to recognise the significance of this anniversary. The Holocaust was a singular evil, an act of calculated barbarity to which few, if any, others can ever compare. The number of victims is difficult to comprehend. 2 in every 3 Jews in Europe were murdered, alongside millions of Slavic people, Roma, disabled people, LGBT people, prisoners of war, communists and other political and religious opponents of the Nazis. More Jews were killed than there are people in Scotland today. Far more. Entire communities were eradicated, the people murdered, and all trace of their existence destroyed. Before the Second World War, there were 3.5 million Jews in Poland. After the war, barely a few 100,000 remained. The scale of these atrocities is so vast that it makes remembrance harder. The sheer number of deaths carries a danger of depersonalization, that we remember only the numbers and not the names, the faces, the people and their stories. As the Holocaust moves out of living memory, we have a duty not to let this happen. The industrial, military and political capacity of a European superpower was for the first time in history directed to the purpose of genocide, to the annihilation of the Jewish people, not as a byproduct of conflict or a means to some other end, but as the end, the objective in and of itself. But evil like that doesn't emerge unannounced. It festers and grows. The Nazis were in power for 9 years before their final solution was agreed to. It was the culmination in their case of years of anti-Semitic laws and systematic oppression by all available levers of the state. And before that, not by decades, but by centuries of anti-Jewish hatred. That hatred, often manifested in conspiracy theories, wasn't destroyed alongside the Nazi regime. From one end of Europe to the other, we see it today, whether it's in Viktor Orban's Hungary or in the challenges faced by our Jewish community here in Scotland and across the UK. Nazi propaganda wasn't true or rational, but that didn't matter. They spread lies about Jews being responsible for Germany losing the First World War and plotting world domination. They relished in fake science to justify their claims of certain groups of people being inferior. That these were lies didn't halt the advance of fascism. Instead, the fascists created their own reality and made many people in their society believe it. They built on prejudice and intolerance that already existed and turned it into something even more murderous. And whether it's Rothschild or Soros conspiracies, accusations about control of the media or dual loyalty, that same underlying hatred continues to fester in European society. 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, we have not truly vanquished the ideology that drove it. In the last few years, it certainly feels like those voicing hatred, whether against Jews, Muslims, Roma, or other groups within our society, have become not just more confident, but have regained some level of legitimacy, which many had hoped was never coming back. Major newspapers in this country print articles describing refugees as cockroaches who should be met with gunboats. Last year, the Ferret found that an openly fascist group had plans to infiltrate community councils to try and establish a network here in Scotland. The Sun managed to publish an article late last year, for which they've still not apologised, whose sources included the neo-Nazi website Aryan Report. In Poland, there are cities and entire provinces that have declared themselves LGBT-free zones, and the ruling party has sought to present the LGBT community as Western European ideology that is alien to Poland and a threat to Polish families. The Prime Minister of Poland, a European leader, is currently engaging in historical revisionism around the Holocaust. And across the Atlantic, in the capital of the defeated Confederacy, hundreds of neo-Nazis felt confident enough to march in the open, their identities unobscured, chanting that Jews will not replace them. It's not enough for us, especially those of us in public life, to simply not be racist. We need to be actively anti-racist and anti-fascist. We must remember the history of anti-fascism in this country, including events like the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when the Jewish community in the East End of London, alongside communists, socialists and other anti-fascists, defeated Oswald Mosley's BUF black shirts. One of those anti-fascists, Leslie Spoorer, was someone known to a number of members of this Parliament. He went on to be a long-time member of the Scottish Labour Party and a close friend of Robin Cook, before going on to found my party, the Scottish Greens. But again, simply remembering anti-fascism isn't enough. We must actively continue that struggle every day. I was honoured to be invited by the European Jewish Association to join their delegation to Auschwitz this week, and it's a source of deep regret that I wasn't able to do so. But I am, as we all are, incredibly grateful to the work of the Holocaust Education Trust and others who ensure that hundreds of young people across Scotland have this valuable experience. At Auschwitz, you can witness the infrastructure of evil, the unsettling mix of administrative banality and murderous horror. The stories of Auschwitz, especially those of Scottish victims and survivors who later settled here, are ones we must never stop telling. Stories like that of Jane Haining, who's already been mentioned, the Church of Scotland worker who refused instructions to return to the UK, who denied herself that safe passage and who was murdered at that camp for refusing to abandon the Jewish girls that she cared for. Or Judith Rosenberg, who's Scotland's last Auschwitz survivor. Judith has once again told her story to the BBC again this year. And as Jane Haining's story has gradually been uncovered in recent years, I'm pleased to see that momentum is growing behind proposals for a statue or another fitting memorial tour to join the cairn in her native Dumfriesshire and the stained glass windows in Queen's Park Parish Church in Govan Hill. It's our responsibility to never forget, to never stop telling these stories. But it is also fitting to celebrate those who are with us today, the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren of survivors who simply would not exist if Nazism had not been defeated. The horror of what the Nazis did cannot be undone, but they did not win. Our Jewish and Roma friends stand testament to that. The very least that we can do for them and for those who did not survive is to never stop telling this story, never stop educating those who come after us of this horror and what led to it, and to never stop opposing the forces of hatred wherever they emerge. The Greens support this motion.
Thank you. I call Alec Cole-Hammond to work for the Liberal Democrats, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's my great privilege to speak for the Liberal Democrats in this important debate. Monsters are real. They may wear business suits or military uniforms, but they have walked among us. We see the evidence of their works in the bleaker chapters of human history, and this week, Presiding Officer, we recognise the darkest chapter of all in Holocaust Memorial Day. We remember the persecution and the mechanised slaughter of over 17 million people, more than a third of them Jewish, whole communities, huge segments of entire races, and those the Nazis found to be deviant, seditious, disabled, rounded up and shipped to camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Belsen to be murdered. This outrageous regime was only made possible with the total capitulation of thousands of otherwise normal people, and among them the handful of decent people who Ruth Davidson reminds us averted their eyes. Of this, the Italian writer, the Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, said that monsters exist, but they are too few in number to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries, ready to believe and to act without asking questions. The Nazis were successful in mass murder because they desensitized it, they normalized it. They inured every level of government and military to atrocity with endless layers of bureaucracy that reduced millions of lives to the lines in a ledger book, transport manifests, and piles of unclaimed belongings. The philosopher Hannah Arendt described this as the banality of evil when she covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. Sitting across from this little grey man in court, the architect of the final solution as he was, Arendt described what she calls the dilemma between the unspeakable horror of the deeds and undeniable ludicrousness of the man who perpetrated them. He was, she said, terribly and terrifyingly normal. There are photographs of Eichmann at that trial, a gaunt and elderly man in a suit, straining to hear the translation of the case against him. Yet this same man was reported to have said in Argentina before his capture by agents of Mossad and Shin Bet that he would leap laughing into the grave because the feeling of 5 million people on his conscience would be for him a tremendous source of satisfaction. Monsters are real, presiding officer. It is that realization that horrific acts can be committed by humdrum men which represents, for me, the most powerful warning of the Holocaust, and we must keep reminding ourselves of that. This period of history begins to move out of living memory. That has already been said, and it is incumbent on all of us to keep that memory alive and to pass it on to our children and to theirs to come. And to that end, Presiding Officer, I'm very proud to be a patron of Vision Schools, the award that we heard about in Time for Reflection. It's an initiative devised by the School of Education at the University of West of Scotland, and they are doing their best to educate Scottish children around the country. And research shows how imperative that work is, because according to a poll reported by the BBC News recently, 1 in 20 UK adults believe the Holocaust just did not happen. A full eighth of our population believe that it has been exaggerated. Now, I have told the Chamber before about the incident last year when I spent some time in hospital. At one point, the discussion on the ward moved to the Second World War when the man in the bed opposite volunteered his own belief that the Holocaust was all a hoax. In the argument that followed, he revealed that the basis for his position was rooted in some videos he'd seen on YouTube. Presiding Officer, challenging anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial falls to each of us. We have seen the grim evidence of its revival in the rise of casual anti-Semitism in the UK and the 2 mass shootings in crowded synagogues in the last year alone. This isn't going away. Hate still blooms against the Jewish people and many of those others persecuted by the Nazis. It advances incrementally, and if it goes unchecked, it could blossom into atrocity once again. We must do everything we can to stamp it out. Presiding Officer, when we speak about the Holocaust, we speak too readily about the monsters. In the study of its gruesome history, we come to the names of its perpetrators before we come to the names of its victims and survivors. But perhaps that is because the names of those who perished are so innumerable, their stories too heartbreaking. But yesterday, in the coverage of the events at the memorial at Auschwitz, we were able to remedy that to a degree. We heard the accounts of people like David Marks and Yvonne Engelman, who spoke with such courage of their first-hand witness to the cattle trucks, the marches, the death by starvation, firing squad, cold and gas chamber. Their words should be seared into the hearts of every person, and the preservation of their memory should be an obligation for all humanity. The fact that we are here, living amongst many of the communities that the Holocaust sought to extinguish, is evidence that the Nazis failed, that human spirit prevailed over evil. I was reminded of that when, on a parliamentary visit to Strasbourg in 2017, I stopped with other colleagues at the synagogue de Pierre, which is built on the site of the old Gestapo headquarters of Western Europe. Above the front door is written a legend in French and in Hebrew. "Stronger than the sword is my soul," it reads. Presiding Officer, those words are steeped both in hope and in defiance, qualities that we see in the sentiment in this debate and that we share as we collectively commemorate the legacy of that awful stain on human history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Move to the open debate. There is no time in hand, so I'm afraid it has to be a firm 6 minutes. I call Kenneth Gibson, followed by Jeremy Balfour. Mr Gibson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn, said Robert Burns, and this was never truer than in the Holocaust. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, at least 1.1 million people, including tens of thousands of Poles, Soviet prisoners of war and others, were murdered. However, 90% of the slain were Jews, killed only because they were Jews. Because a few thousand inmates survived, more people died there and much of it remains intact. Auschwitz evokes our greatest understanding of the Holocaust and its horrors. Nevertheless, we cannot forget the almost 2 million Jewish people murdered in the extermination centres at Belzec, Chelno, Mali Trostanet, Sobibor and Treblinka, from which, in total, only 110 prisoners survived the war. Or other hundreds of concentration camps from Belzec to Majdanek, in ghettos of disease, starvation or exhaustion, or killing sites such as Baba Yar, where entire communities were annihilated amidst great terror, despair and bewilderment. 6 million Jews murdered in total. Sadly, anti-Semitism remains with us. At last month's general election here in Scotland, the only European nation never to have imposed laws directly against Jewish people, the Conservative, Labour and Scottish National parties each suspended candidates for anti-Semitic comments. Paradoxically, the more time passes, the greater the risk of future generations perceiving the Holocaust as an abstract, almost mythical concept dissociated from reality. The almost unimaginable scale and scope of the atrocities contribute to that risk. After all, how could this have happened? A common misconception is that the Holocaust was perpetrated by a small group of odious political and military fanatics. This could not be further from the truth. Doctors conducted medical experiments involving surgery on Jewish children and others without anaesthetic. The legal system helped isolate Jews as a precursor to genocide. Railway workers transported them across Europe, and architects designed the death camps. At Auschwitz alone, 6,161 men and 174 women served in the SS garrison. Pre-war Germany, despite its Nazi regime, was seen as one of the most civilised and cultured societies in the world, and yet the Holocaust happened. So when information came out about it, it wasn't believed by many in Western Allied states. With it, it must be said, the often active participation of many others from a host of nationalities and political traditions across Europe. Of course, we must not forget the righteous Gentiles, those who often paid with their lives to save Jews they might not even have known, but felt compelled to save through their common humanity. Just because people are watching doesn't mean genocide cannot and will not happen. From April 1994, the world looked on as atrocities unfolded in Rwanda during a 3-month frenzied campaign of genocide. An estimated 800,000 men, women and children of the Tutsi minority were brutally slaughtered by Hutu extremists. United Nations soldiers were there and did nothing. Barely a year passed when in July 1995 the world again watched as Bosniak men and boys were massacred near Srebrenica at the hands of Bosnian Serb forces. Again, UN forces were there, wasting time with bureaucracy, failing to intervene, turning people away from their base to near certain death. Within 72 hours, 8,732 Muslim men and boys were murdered in Srebrenica alone. All but a handful of Holocaust survivors who lived to tell their personal experiences have now passed away. It's up to us, not them, to make sure we understand. Doing so allows us to recognise that anti-Semitism did not just rear its head again recently. It never ended with the Second World War. In 1946, 42 Jews, including a newborn baby and a woman 6 months pregnant, were brutally murdered during the Kielce pogrom in Poland. Police, civilians and soldiers attacked Jews with clubs and iron bars after, according to his father, an 8-year-old boy hadn't come home one night and claimed the next morning to have been held in a Jewish-owned building. It was nonsense, of course, but a town which had lost all but 200 of its 30,000 pre-war Jewish community believed it. Having just survived the Holocaust and returned home only for anti-Semitic violence to continue was a massive blow to the Jewish-Polish community. As Eastern Europe disappeared behind the Iron Curtain from Czechoslovakia to Hungary to Romania, ruling communist parties purged and executed hundreds of Jewish comrades who survived the Holocaust. In Stalin's Soviet Union, this occurred in parallel with the ludicrous doctors' plot leading to the arrest and execution of eminent Jewish doctors who supposedly plotted against Stalin. State-sponsored anti-Semitism intensified to such a degree it effectively descended into a coordinated campaign vilifying Soviet Jews as rootless cosmopolitans and a plan to deport the 2 million who had not fallen into Nazi hands to Siberia and likely for many death. Only Stalin's demise before implementation saved them. Jews were often called parasites for living in other societies. Now they're vilified if they support Zionism in Israel, a nation held to higher standards of behaviour than probably any other, despite the nature of the intolerant, undemocratic, sectarian and homophobic societies that surround it. It is the Jew among nations. That anti-Semitism is still an issue 75 years on is indicative of problems in our society today and must be rooted out. Last year, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights published a poll of Jewish perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism in the UK. It found that 75% of British Jews think anti-Semitism is a very big or fairly big problem in the UK, compared to 48% in 2012. Shockingly, 84% said anti-Semitism was present in political life, the highest figure in Europe. Sticking our heads in the sand is not an option when the reality is that not only can anti-Semitism rise again, it has. Awareness doesn't make it stop and action is needed. But as Presiding Officer, let me conclude by asking everyone who remembers the millions who died to also remember those who survived the Holocaust and other genocides. Many spent the rest of their lives with the trauma of being degraded, injured and deprived of their loved ones and homes. Many subsequently, often decades later, from Nobel Prize winner and Auschwitz survivor Prima Levi to Richard Glazer, survivor of Treblinka, prisoners' revolt, took their own lives. The Holocaust must never be allowed to happen again and must never be forgotten.
Thank you very much, Mr Gibson. Call Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Tom Arthur. Mr Balfour, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm honoured to take part in this debate this afternoon. We've heard from the Cabinet Secretary and from others the numbers of people that were murdered during the Holocaust. We've heard testimonials from stories on our newspapers and on our televisions over the last few days. The average length for someone that went to Auschwitz was 3 months. Last Tuesday, I had the honour to go with the European Jewish Association to Auschwitz to visit and to remember. I'd been to Auschwitz before, but I think for me the visit was even harsher and difficulter, as I stood there with a majority of people who were Jewish, knowing that if I'd been standing with them 75 years ago, most of them would have been dead. Rabbis, mothers, children. Anybody who the Nazi race decided had to be killed, whether they came from different ethnic backgrounds or had different disabilities. And as one speaker has already commented, it is sometimes difficult to see the full impact of what happened in those places because of the numbers. And like the Cabinet Secretary, I think what left me with the hardest memory was the number of shoes, the suitcases, the hair, the prayer mats, the toys of young children, which were never going to be used again. And it is right, and I am grateful to the government for having this government debate this afternoon. But on the day after Auschwitz, we had different talks from Jewish leaders and rabbis across Western Europe. And the message that they wanted me and others to take home to our countries was, yes, we have to remember. Yes, we have to keep using the words, this must never happen again. But beyond that, we have to root out anti-Semitism in our culture and in our countries. Whether that's on social media, whether that's in conversations with people that we come across, or whether that is in educating those that will come after us. All of that is our responsibility. We cannot turn our backs and leave it to someone else. It is clear across our world, across our continent, and even sadly in our nation, anti-Semitism is on the rise. As Ruth Davidson commented, there are cameras and security guards in most synagogues across our country because of a fear of what might happen. We need to challenge this. Not only challenge it, we have to root it out and say in 21st century Scotland, this is unacceptable. One of the psalms that was read in Auschwitz on a daily basis and has been used by Jewish scholars reflecting on it was Psalm 102. And I would like to finish by quoting the end of that psalm, Deputy Presiding Officer. It refers to Yahweh, the God of the Jews, who says, "But you remain the same, and your years will never end. The children of your servants will live in your presence. The descendants will be established before you." Amen.
Thank you very much. I call Tom Arthur to be followed by Ian Gray. Mr. Arthur, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful and humbled for the opportunity to participate in this debate, particularly after the outstanding contributions we have had from members across the Chamber. One theme that has emerged is the incomprehensibility of the scale of the crime that was committed. 6 million Jewish human beings. The population of Scotland is 5.4 million. The scale is beyond what I think any individual can possibly compute into any meaningful experience. It is too much. But where a sense of empathy and understanding can emerge is in considering some of the individual accounts. Take one, very small, but for me, profound. Viktor Frankl, in his memoir of the Holocaust, Man's Search for Meaning, describes the experience of having been admitted into a camp, of being forced to undress. And prior to having his hair, along with other prisoners, shaved, they were ordered to hand over any medals, any jewellery that he had in possession. And one new inmate asked another inmate who was supervising, can I keep this medal? And the inmate supervising laughed, because clearly this new inmate hadn't realised where he had arrived. And Mr. Franco had to give over his wedding ring. And I thought about that. Imagine being rounded up, taken, transported, separated from your partner, your loved one, and forced to hand over your wedding ring, never to see it again. That complete dehumanisation that occurs, which is amplified because having taken your clothes, having taken your jewellery, they then take your hair, and then they take your name and replace it with a number. It's these small stories which bring to life the horror of what occurred in Europe between 1939 and 1945. Another very simple example is a task given to the Sonderkommando. Those were the Jewish prisoners charged with working in the crematoria, and the elaborate ruse and deception that they had to participate in. Before entering the gas chamber, the prisoners were instructed to tie their shoelaces together so that they could be retrieved easily once they had had their shower. To imagine what that must have been like to participate in that behaviour, that false reassurance, the sheer inhumanity of it. I find these very small accounts and stories can often be far more profound and more powerful than attempting the seemingly impossible task of trying to contemplate the sheer scale of the crime that was perpetrated against the Jewish people, against gypsies, Romas, the LGBT community, political dissidents, and many others. Presiding Officer, the theme of the Holocaust Memorial Day 2020 is Stand Together. But there's also another theme emerging, that of a renewed urgency among survivors of the Holocaust to communicate the lessons of the Holocaust. To acknowledge, to reflect, to remember is not enough. We must learn. And we must learn in the deepest and most profound sense of the word. That learning cannot be limited to only understanding the Holocaust as an historical event. It has to be more than demonstrating an understanding of the causes of the Holocaust. The learning required needs to be like an inoculation, or of the visceral or reflexive kind we develop as a child in response to danger. And with that, an awareness, an alertness, and a sensitivity to the trends and behaviours that are analogous to those that preceded the Holocaust. This has to start with each of us as individuals, in our own thoughts, in our own hearts, and how we treat each other. In this Parliament, we have our disagreements, we have our disputes, but we stand together, we stand united. And we must always reaffirm those values. And we must always reaffirm our fundamental shared humanity. To cultivate a passion to understand and to learn from each other. To cherish each relationship we have. To understand and respect our differences. And to celebrate that which unites us in our common humanity. Our ability to reason and our capacity to love each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arthur. I call Ian Gray to be followed by Joan McAlpine. Mr. Gray, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Plato said that those who tell the stories rule society. And that is why this day, when we ensure that the story of genocide, humanity's capacity to descend into the evil of systematic mass murder is ever told and never forgotten is so important. And as we've heard, this is a special Holocaust Memorial Day because it was exactly 75 years ago that Auschwitz, the camp which has come to symbolise the Holocaust above all others, was liberated. Over 1 million had died at Auschwitz and Birkenau nearby, along with many millions more throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. 6 million of them Jews, but also Roma, LGBT people, disabled people, and anti-fascists of every stripe. The themes of Holocaust Memorial Day in 2020 are stand together and never again. And yet, as we've heard, the truth is that the 75 years since the Holocaust have been marked by our failure to live up to that promise of never again. 45 years ago, the Khmer Rouge began the mass murder of over 1 million of mostly their own people. 26 years ago, 1 million Tutsis were slaughtered by their Hutu neighbours in a matter of a few weeks in Rwanda. And 25 years ago, genocide stalked Europe again in Srebrenica in Bosnia. Since the Holocaust, we have not stood together against genocide. Hannah Arendt, who, as Alex Cole-Hamilton told us, coined the phrase, the banality of evil, also said, the sad truth is that most evil is done by those who never make up their minds to be good or evil. And too often in living memory, we have made our minds up too late. After all, as Kenny Gibson told us, in both Rwanda and Srebrenica, the very United Nations forces we created in the aftermath of World War II to stop mass murder prevailing were actually there on the ground. In Rwanda, they were ordered to stand by and watch the murder of the Tutsis and then withdrawn altogether, with some of them burning their blue berets on the airport tarmac for shame. And in Srebrenica, Dutch UN soldiers didn't just stand by, they helped Bosnian Serb forces separate Muslim men from their wives and mothers, and 8,000 of those men were taken away and murdered. And then the soldiers parted when they were allowed to leave. One survivor of the Rwandan genocide said this, "It will take the love of the entire world to heal my homeland." And that's as it should be. For what happened in Rwanda happened to us all. Humanity was wounded by the genocide. Presiding officer, like Ruth Davidson, I've never been to Auschwitz, but I have been elsewhere. I've seen Tuol Sleng in Phnom Penh, where thousands were tortured and murdered. I was in Rwanda weeks after the genocide there, when the evil that was done still lingered in that strange and empty country. And I've been to Srebrenica, to the factory where Bosniaks sought refuge with the UN, and to the cemetery across the road where over 7,000 of them are buried after that refuge was refused. To be in these places is to know that all humanity is wounded, that we cannot escape our own complicity, that these stories are our stories too. Now, yesterday, I was honoured with Daniel Johnson to host Scotland's National Holocaust Memorial Day event here with the First Minister speaking for us all. And we heard from Janine Weber, Holocaust survivor, and Hassan Hassanovic, who survived the death march from Srebrenica, but lost his father and twin brother. Presiding officer, the burden of bearing witness we ask of these people is a heavy one. They must remember so that we cannot forget. They must relive their pain so that we cannot plead ignorance. They are condemned to tell and retell their story to make sure that we understand our part in it. And what is the beginning of that story? It is not the gas chambers or the machete gangs of Kigali or the blood-soaked meadows of Srebrenica. For German Jews, Rwandan Tutsis, Bosnian Muslims, it began with their neighbours, their workmates, those they thought were friends, even with their in-laws, It began with the language of us and them. And it didn't end with the genocide, for what follows is denial. Like that of the current mayor of Srebrenica, who claims the genocide never happened and the 7,000 graves in his town are faked. Or the Austrian author and Srebrenica genocide denier, shamefully awarded the Nobel Prize just last month. So we must tell and retell the true stories of the Holocaust and the other genocides so that the truth prevails. And we must call out the language of hate, division and denial in our own communities, our own parties sometimes, even our own families if need be. It is only thus that we choose to be good, not evil. It is only thus that we earn the right to say we stand together, and only thus that we earn the right to say never again.
Thank you very much. Call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Bill Bowman. Ms McAlpine, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin my speech by paying tribute, as others have, to a remarkable woman who perished at Auschwitz. Jane Haining from the village of Dunscore, Dumfriesshire, died because she protected and loved the Jewish children in her care at the Church of Scotland Missionary School in Budapest, where she was matron. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for praising Jane in her opening speech. Reading her biography, A Life of Love and Courage by Mary Miller, which informed an excellent feature by Neil Mackay in the Herald this weekend, it's clear that Jane was that very rare thing, a truly selfless person. A farmer's daughter born in 1909, by the time she was 5, she had lost her mother, but she excelled at school, won a bursary to Dumfries Academy and became Dux. After working in Coates Mill in Paisley, she decided to devote her life to others, and that path took her to Hungary, where she became surrogate mother to the girls in her care, who were both Christian and Jewish, and often poor and orphaned. Jane, as other speakers have said, had the opportunity to return to the safety of Scotland when war broke out, but she refused. If these children needed me in days of sunshine, she said, how much more do they need me in days of darkness? Soon she was taking in refugee children from occupied countries, and when Budapest fell under Nazi control in 1944, she was arrested by the Gestapo and accused of consorting with Jews. One of her so-called crimes was, quotes, being seen to weep when her girls were forced to sew yellow stars onto their uniforms. She arrived in Auschwitz on 15th of May 1944, and on the 17th of July, documents show she was admitted to Birkenau, the extermination part of the vast complex. 1 million people died in Birkenau alone, 900,000 of them Jewish. In the summer of 1944, in just 8 weeks, 424,000 were transported there from Hungary. That's in addition to the 80,000 shot dead on the banks of the Danube that summer, and 70,000 starved or murdered in the Budapest ghetto. The near elimination of European Jewry was poignantly illustrated to the parishioners from Jane's village church in Dunscore when they travelled to Budapest in 2016 to pay their respects, and they visited the synagogue where Jane's girls would have worshipped. It was built to seat 3,500 people, and now they have around 200 worshippers on a Friday at most. Jane's sacrifice shows that the non-Jews were also victims of the Nazis, as Eileen Campbell reminded us. Others were Roma, disabled people, the mentally ill, gay people who perished in the camps, along with political opponents, particularly communists. But we must never forget that the Holocaust, also known as the Shoah, was the genocide of 2/3 of Europe's Jews. 6 million people. The Shoah was a crime against Jewish people and the culmination of centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe. There have been other genocides, and it's absolutely correct that we remember them and learn lessons. But World War II's Holocaust there was something exceptional about it. It was exceptional in its scale and its approach. It was premeditated and meticulously planned by a modern state. It was mechanized mass murder in cold blood, deploying the technology that Germany had perfected. Mary Miller's book on Jane Haining notes that in the month that she died, the commandant in charge of the crematorium at Auschwitz ordered sophisticated sieving machinery in order to separate larger pieces of bone from the cinders of human beings which were being dumped in nearby ponds. The Shoah was not an outbreak of uncontrolled, frenzied violence, such as we see in conflict zones across the world where society is brutalised and the rule of law collapses. The concentration camps were planned, built and managed by detached bureaucrats. The entire apparatus of the state, its courts and legal processes were all designed to support these death factories. Holocaust Memorial Day falls on the anniversary of the Red Army's liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which of course dwarfed the death camps in scale. And in fleeing the camp, the Nazis left evidence of their crime, and of course, because it was a forced labour camp, there were many surviving eyewitnesses. But what we mustn't allow our understandable focus on Auschwitz in this 75th anniversary to obscure the historical fact that the Holocaust stretched far beyond that vast extermination complex. It was a widespread programme of murder right across occupied Europe. In the Netherlands, France, Greece, Hungary, Norway, Poland, Germany itself, Jewish men, women and children were rounded up in plain sight, forced onto cattle trucks transporting them east. And the railway network itself was designed around the extermination programme. And as Pauline McNeill said, there were other death camps. 900,000 died at Treblinka, 500,000 at Belzec, 250,000 at Sobibor. And of course, there were other examples of the first stage of systematic killing carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and the mobile killing units in the east who gassed people in the backs of lorries. As others have said, all these atrocities were witnessed by good men who did nothing. But brave people, including Jane Haining, did not stand aside, and instead they stood up for others and paid the ultimate price. As others have said, Jane is honoured as righteous amongst nations in Israel, and she has a memorial in Dunscore Church in her home village. But I agree that the time has come for us to pay her a lot more attention nationally in Scotland, and the time has come for some sort of national memorial. Presiding Officer, to conclude, we are told that the Holocaust reminds us of the depths to which human beings can sink. The selflessness of Jane Haining and others reminds us that there is good in this world and there are human beings who rose up against evil, and that is something we must never forget. Thank you.
A reminder that time is really tight in this debate. I have Bill Bowman to be followed by Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I feel privileged to speak in this debate in a chamber where the mood is serious, and rightly so. On this Holocaust Memorial Day and the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau camps, it is as important as ever that we remember the Holocaust and never forget one of history's darkest moments. This day also coincides with the 25th anniversary of the genocide at Srebrenica in Bosnia. Holocaust Memorial Day remembers the horrors of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. However, it is important to remember that the other genocides, including those, as have been mentioned, for example, in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur, that are also commemorated on this day. It may be in my speech that I will mention what others have already said, but this is a topic where repetition and reinforcement is necessary. Holocaust Memorial Day has been commemorated since 2000 and was instituted after 46 of the world's governments signed the Stockholm Declaration. The 7 points of the Declaration commit its signatories to remember the victims who perished, respect the survivors still with us, and reaffirm humanity's common aspiration for mutual understanding and justice. Holocaust Memorial Day coincides with the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and yesterday marked the 75th anniversary of that, and could be the last commemoration where Holocaust survivors will attend. The memory of one of the most horrific events fades with the passing of those who endured it. However, it is more important than ever to teach its lessons, as anti-Semitism and the proliferation of extremist views are re-emergent. In a recent poll, more than 80% of European Jews admitted to feeling unsafe. A new strain of anti-Semitic opinion is growing, and views that would recently have been regarded as abhorrent are now met with a resigned shrug in many cases. A recent poll of over 2,000 people carried out by Opinion Matters for the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust lays bare the levels of ignorance of the scale of the Holocaust among British adults. I think it has been mentioned, it found that 1 in 20 did not believe the Holocaust took place. 1 in 12 believes its scale has been exaggerated, and 1 in 5 believed only 2 million Jews were murdered. This equates to 5% of the UK adults not believing the Holocaust actually happened. That is why it is extremely important that the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government are providing £1 million of funding for the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation, which will support the consolidation, restoration and long-term maintenance of the Auschwitz and Birkenau concentration camps. This donation will help to support the preservation of the site so that we can never forget the horror of the Holocaust and educate future generations so it will not be repeated. I have been fortunate to visit Auschwitz in Poland, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, and Yad Vashem in Israel. These are all powerful memories to me and powerful memorials to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, with Yad Vashem dedicated to preserving the memory of the dead, honouring Jews who fought against the Nazi oppressors, and researching the Holocaust and genocide with the aim of avoiding such events in the future. It is therefore encouraging news that the UK Government has also committed £50 million to a National Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre. The sum was committed in 2015 with a further £25 million committed last year, contingent on match funding and certain other conditions. This will allow us to educate and remember the horrors that have been committed in the past and ensure that it never happens again. As I mentioned before, it is important to remember the atrocities that have been committed elsewhere as well. In Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Darfur, where between 200 and 400,000 civilians have been killed in the civil war in Western Sudan, and up to 2.6 million people are still displaced. The Nazis murdered 6 million Jewish men, women and children. We must continue to educate, commemorate and remember these events to ensure that it does not happen again. Last year, over 11,000 commemorative events took place across the UK as part of the Holocaust Memorial Day. There are also permanent memorials to the Holocaust victims across the UK. One such memorial is in Broughty Ferry in my region. 2 pupils from Grove Academy visited Auschwitz and upon their return met with the representatives from Dundee City Council to discuss the idea of creating a memorial. It is located in Windmill Gardens in Broughty Ferry, and the memorial reads, "To the 6 million Jews and the other victims murdered in the Nazi death camps, and to all who have experienced the horrors of genocide and the destruction caused by prejudice and discrimination, we will remember." The plaque also features a quote from Anne Frank, which reads, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." A voice from the past that still speaks clearly today. We must stand together. Thank you.
Bill Kidd, followed by Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Pardon me. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest Nazi death camp, and between August 1941 and the liberation of its camps, 1.3 million people were held there. Of this number, 1.1 million sent there died. The horrors that took place make Auschwitz synonymous with the Holocaust and the so-called final solution of the Nazis. In Auschwitz, the 1.1 million who died included the death of 960,000 Jews, 74,000 non-Jewish Poles, 21,000 Roma people, 15,000 Slavic prisoners of war, and up to 15,000 other Europeans. The Auschwitz extermination camps housed the notorious Nazi-devised gas chambers, and upon arrival to Auschwitz, the vast majority of Jews were immediately sent to these gas chambers if they did not look fit or able to do forced labour. The flick of a finger left to the gas chambers or right to the work camps. Those arriving had no idea how sinister this small movement of the hand was and what it would mean for their lives. It would only be the next day they would find out that family members, friends and loved ones sent to the left were now in the smoke rising out of chimneys in the distance. Survivors and psychologists Viktor Frankl and Edith Eger both spoke of this same experience about learning the incomprehensible fate of their friends and loved ones.
Of the 960,000 Jews killed in Auschwitz, 865,000 were killed on arrival as a direct result of this left-pointing finger. Stories from survivors detail the torture, starvation, disease and apathy that followed arrival. Once the shock had sunk in, people battled with the realisation there would be no reprieve from the hardships they would have to endure. Stripped of their belongings, stripped of their names, shaved bare and beaten cruelly, these people had to comprehend the incomprehensible, that for most there would be no way out. This description is inadequate in depicting the cruel reality endured by those who went through the Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered. This evil underpinned by an ideology of cold racism, a baseless hatred. For us today, it is hard to comprehend how this could have happened. How could such a vile emotion and ideology not only arise, but also take authority in any place or nation? It is perhaps not conducive to dwell and have our thoughts lay too long in the depths of such evil and darkness. However, what can be said and what should be acknowledged is the well-known saying that evil can only triumph if good men do nothing. We cannot be passive. Holocaust Memorial Day makes it clear that the world is not immune from such horrors arising. As we mark this day, there is an onus on us to fuel conviction of this and for all people to be aware of these dangers. By guarding our hearts and keeping them in the right place, we do not let hatred or unforgiveness win. And there may yet be a point in our lives where we have to decide, perhaps at great cost, to do what is right and what is good. We must remain true to our humanity by having the courage to speak out and make honourable decisions. After the Holocaust, the world said never again. One might think surely this question of deciding at great cost, whether social or material, to do the right thing, to avoid repeat, is not relevant to my country or me personally. However, we have seen genocide, a world created to explain the horror of the attempted extermination of the Jews in World War II, happen repeatedly, from Rwanda to Burundi to Srebrenica to South Sudan, and the ongoing news coming out of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. How do we form a response to this when faced by conflicts that seem intractable and hatred that is senseless? It is perhaps best to draw lessons from those who have survived. Doctor and psychiatrist Dr. Viktor Frankl, as mentioned earlier, wrote in 9 days, Man's Search for Meaning, which was published in 1946 as a survivor of Auschwitz. He incredibly dedicated his life after liberation to help others find meaning in their lives and used this as a basis for therapy. In his book, he wrote of his experiences and said, the experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples of often a heroic nature which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men and women who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The testimony of Viktor Frankl and many others draws our attention to the best of humanity, that even in these dire situations, the best of humanity, that is hope and love, perseveres. Against the greatest darkness, light cannot be overcome, cloaked or concealed. Even a small flicker of light is much stronger than the darkness around it. Hope and love persevere and ultimately win. Today we stand in solidarity with the survivors and for those who lost their lives. Thank you.
Anna Sarwar, followed by Fulton McGregor.
Presiding Officer, there are moments in this Parliament that I think reflect some of the worst of our politics sometimes. But actually this debate reflects the best of our politics and, more importantly, I think the best of our collective humanity. Listening to the speeches from members from different sides of this chamber shows that we should never forget that there is so much more that unites us and that we can find common cause on than what divides us. When I was listening in particular to the contributions of both Ruth Davidson and Ian Gray, I thought for a moment around what it would be like if that was my family, if that was my child going through those absolutely horrific incidents, whether that be in Auschwitz, in Srebrenica, in Rwanda, or anywhere else where there is tyranny and injustice. Because we often say, when it comes to Holocaust Memorial Day, or when we commemorate other acts of tragedy across the world, never forget and never again. But the reality is, we do forget, and it does happen again. We do forget that actually the politics of hatred is still alive, well and kicking here in the UK and indeed across the world, that in some places it's on the rise across the world. We do forget that we still create the us versus them politics and the us versus them society that treats others as if they are different, and that difference is one that allows prejudice or hatred against that community and the othering of whole communities. We do forget, and that leads to mass deportations, it leads to torture, it leads to bloodbaths, it leads to murder, and it leads to injustice based purely on someone's nationality, their faith, the colour of their skin, their sexuality, or their gender. We do forget, and it does happen again. 75 years since the Holocaust, we have to send a message of solidarity with all members of our Jewish community here in Scotland, across the UK and across the world, indeed with all communities that lost loved ones or ancestors in that war. But we can't be complacent. We can't be complacent that the fight against anti-Semitism has been won, or that somehow what happened then could never happen again. We do still have communities in our own country who fear getting on the public transport system to going to work. We do have communities in our own society who fear being abused as they take their child to school in the morning. We have those in our society who have been abused, racially abused. We have places of worship, whether that be synagogues, whether that be mosques, whether it be gurdwaras or mandirs or churches, that are supposed to be the symbols of peace, that are supposed to be the symbols of unity and togetherness, that have been attacked both at home and abroad, promoting that hatred, promoting that prejudice. And that's why I welcome the announcement from the government this week around the Safety and Security at Places of Worship Fund. It's something that is long overdue, and I'm sure is something that we wish we didn't have to have, but we do need to have to make sure that everyone feels safe going about their daily lives and going about their places of worship. Now, we say never again. I was in Bosnia. I know many members have been to Srebrenica through remembering Srebrenica. I was there last year, and that was a genocide that took place just 25 years ago. Let's not forget that in 1984, Sarajevo hosted the Olympic Games. It had the eyes of the world on it. It was seen as a symbol of diversity, a symbol of openness, a symbol of an open and inclusive society. But just 8 short years later, we had divisions based around faith and identity, and it led to the genocide of thousands and thousands of people, 160,000 people losing their lives over a 4-year period. We say never again, but it happens again. And I fear that the world that my children are going to grow up in is going to be an even more divided and hate-filled world than I grew up in. I wasn't alive when the Holocaust took place. I probably wasn't even politically conscious when the Srebrenica tragedy and the Bosnian genocide took place. So I've probably not really lived and felt what a genocide taking place in my own adult lifetime feels like. But I don't think we can be complacent that something like that might not happen anytime soon again. And that's why we have to redouble our efforts to take on prejudice and hatred. And what that means in practice is silence isn't an option. We shouldn't pick and choose a side of either condemnation or solidarity based on either the identity or the politics of the perceived perpetrator or the victim. We should call out any kind of hatred wherever it exists, no matter which political party, even if it's our own, no matter which institution, even if we want to defend it, and no matter which group of society it comes from. Because only if we together recognise that it's not for individual communities to take on the fight against prejudice or hatred alone, but a fight for all of us, will we make sure that we challenge anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, bigotry, sexism, and every other form of prejudice again. In closing, I want to say a special thank you to the Holocaust Education Trust, to all those people that are involved in making sure that we never forget the tragedies of the past and make sure that we keep the stories of those Holocaust survivors alive. Our Holocaust survivors will eventually lose their lives. We've got to make sure the lessons that they teach never die. Thank you.
Wilton McGregor, followed by Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and it really is a great privilege to speak in this afternoon's debate on Holocaust Memorial Day. This is a day to commemorate the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp and to commemorate and remember those who suffered and died at the hands of the Nazis during the Second World War. I would note that this, as others have done this year, is also 25 years since the start of the Bosnian genocide. The atrocity of the Holocaust and other genocides around the world must never be forgotten. It's a vivid reminder that inhumanity, violence and hatred must be challenged, or it will be repeated. We must remember the sufferings and losses of lives to help ensure that no such horror ever happens again. We can only do this by strongly and robustly tackling prejudice and hatred in our society and beyond. I am proud that the Scottish Government is committed to tackling all forms of discrimination, as outlined by the Cabinet Secretary. In Scotland, we have a reputation for fostering and building a multi-faith, multicultural and inclusive society, which is something we should be very proud of. But clearly, we have more to do. It's highly important to build mutual trust, respect and understanding of other cultures, as well as ensuring the eradication of prejudice, hatred, intolerance and discrimination. People in Scotland must be supported to maintain their culture and religion without fear of intolerance. And just as Anas Sarwar has said before me, I too welcome the new Place of Worship Security Fund, which was launched by the Cabinet Secretary and the Justice Secretary earlier in the week. Presiding Officer, I would like to focus my remarks on the Government's ongoing commitment to providing opportunities for Scotland's children and young people to learn about the atrocities of the Holocaust and how that's impacted on young people in my own constituency. Holocaust education, as we know, sits within international and citizenship education and is a key part for the curriculum of excellence, giving our young people the opportunity to learn about the atrocities of the past and giving them an understanding of why this can never happen again. The Scottish Government has been supporting the Holocaust Educational Trust to organise 2 Lessons from Auschwitz project per year from Scotland for over a decade, and I'm pleased that this will continue. The funding for this will continue into 2020-2021. High schools across my constituency in Coatbridge and Chryson have integrated Holocaust education into their curriculum and have engaged students in educational activities which include art projects, presentations and listening to podcasts from Holocaust survivors. This year, 2 pupils from both St Ambrose High School and St Andrews High School in my constituency participated in the project. They report that this trip brought some valuable insights and reflections on racism and intolerance, and by visiting the camp they were able to return to their schools and share this experience with their peers. The visit fuelled discussion in the classroom and all pupils were given a chance to participate and ask questions. And I'm sure that we can all agree that this is an excellent way for our young people to find out firsthand what took place at Auschwitz. And this is certainly a tough place to visit. And like others have reflected in the Chamber, I've not been myself. But it is important that we remember what took place and that our young people learn from the past so that this is never, ever repeated. St Ambrose High School also took part in a minute of silence to show respect to the victims of Holocaust and all victims of genocides around the world. St Andrews High School created a digital presentation and displayed it in a social area for 1 month, which has provided great support for Holocaust education. Pupils from Chryson High School participated in the commemorative service which took place outside the Civic Centre in Motherwell this week. The highlight of this event was a symbolic signing of the Stockholm Declaration, which commits to remembering 6 million Jewish victims and millions of other people around the world that were victims of the Nazi regime in Germany. By signing the declaration, pledging to help educate people of the very real impact of such harrowing events and try to help prevent future genocides. The horrors of the Holocaust are never forgotten, and promote understanding among young people about how important it is to commemorate the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And finally, in Coatbridge High, the head teacher took time out of her busy day today to email me and write about how Holocaust Memorial Day is a main focus of the Humanities Department, and it's used to produce a range of activities to promote a safer and better future. Presiding officer, in Scotland, we are committed to building a safe, resilient and inclusive community by tackling prejudice and hatred. We should never underestimate those who stand up in support of justice, equality and human rights, and it remains crucial that we learn from the past and work together to ensure that all forms of genocide can never happen again. I want to end, Presiding Officer, by reflecting on Christen High School's Holocaust event that I was invited to last year. I was humbled to meet survivor Janine Weber, who's been talked about already in the chamber. She told of her and her family's extraordinary and hugely emotional life story of terror and persecution from the Nazis in their home in Poland. She spoke about being effectively hunted and the loss of people of importance to her in her life over those years. The room fell totally silent as she spoke. What was amazing was that her strength, her kindness, her spirit was all still there. They had not broke her humanity, and she now travels to the UK to remind us of what can happen when othering is allowed. Her message was abundantly clear. Always treat each other with respect and dignity, regardless of race or religion, and never again allow intolerance to bring such shame on humanity. Presiding Officer, she is indeed a true human rights defender. Thank you.
Edward Mountain, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish I was not here giving this speech today on the inhumanity of humanity. I speak in the hope we can all ensure that history never repeats itself. Presiding Officer, I want to recount some events that may help us to remember. In 1983, I joined my regiment in Germany, 22 years old, full of enthusiasm and purpose. I followed a well-trodden route. However, those that did so in 1944-45 may well have gone to the same area, but they did so in very different circumstances. The war was coming to an end, and the full horror and the barbarity of the genocide was only just coming to light. My base was close to Bergen-Belsen, which will be my focus today. Originally, it was a Soviet prisoner of war camp. In 1943, parts of the camp were taken over by the SS to become a holding exchange camp, housing Jewish inmates that could be traded for Germans who were held outside Germany. Conditions, though harsh, were not as bad as other camps such as Auschwitz or Buchenwald, simply because the Jewish inmates were viewed as tradable assets. By the end of 1944, control of the camp was taken over by the commandant of Auschwitz, and the size of the camp dramatically increased to 60,000. Many Poles were sent there, and many women, including Anne Frank, who was to die there sometime in February or March 1945. There were no gas chambers at Belsen. Death occurred through bullet, disease, starvation, or as a last resort being transported to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Suffering was acute, with an estimate of over 50,000 people being killed in the camp during the Nazi tyranny. In 1945, as the Allies neared Bergen-Belsen, orders were given that all inmates were to be executed. Thankfully, it was ignored. And on the 15th of April that year, the camp was handed over voluntarily to the Allies. This, however, was no humanitarian gesture. It was a gesture driven by the wish of the Nazis to prevent the spread of the typhus epidemic to the local population. When the British troops moved down the mile-long road to the camp, they passed decaying corpses. And when they got to the camp, they were ill-prepared for what they met them. And I want to quote Brigadier Glyn Hughes, and he said, "The conditions in the camp were really indescribable. There were various piles of corpses lying all over the camp, some in the huts. The compounds themselves had bodies lying in about them. The gutters were full, and within the hut there were uncountable numbers of bodies, some even in the same bunks as the living." Chaplain Hardman described the prisoners dying there as they stood, and prisoners' clothes so full of lice that they appeared to move on their own accord. And whilst the handover was taking place, murder was still going on. When unobserved, the Hungarian guards who had replaced the SS were still shooting inmates. British troops tried to instill some semblance of order. Camp guards were ordered to bury corpses, and the local Wehrmacht barracks were converted into hospital wards. Some 29,000 prisoners moved through these wards during April and May 1945 alone. Not all the guards were helpful. Many were still viewed the task of caring for those they had tortured below them. Sadly, also the kindness of the liberators also contributed to the death of some of the inmates, the rations that they freely handed out proving too rich for those starving inmates. Now, the main buildings within the camp were so contaminated by disease and lice that all of them were burned, removing the physical evidence of suffering. However, not before that evidence was assembled to try the perpetrators. The subsequent trial resulted in the execution of 16 people, including the commandant and the head female guard, and also the doctor who carried out hideous experiments on the inmates. Now, Presiding Officer, you may well ask why I picked this story to recount today. I do so because in 1983, 37 years ago, I deliberately traced the route that the British force took as they moved to the camp. I did so to fully understand the horrors that had occurred. Through the very woods which were in 1945 were littered with corpses on the way to the camp. And it is just the map of the entrance of the camp that shows the layout of it was, and the location of the mass graves, which would clearly be seen by the mounds that cover the corpses. Now, the only buildings on the site of the museum and the document centre, but there is also a stone memorial. The campsite might not look like it was in 1945. It may well be quiet, but it still felt cold, ominous and evil, and it was. During the entire visit, I never heard a bird sing. It was as if all life had been sucked out of the earth and the sky. Presiding Officer, I will never forget what I saw. If we are to prevent this happening in the future, it is vital we never forget how inhuman humans can be. We must always be vigilant. We must stand together. For often those who seem the most human can be the most inhuman. Thank you.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and it is indeed a privilege to have been called to speak in this most impressive debate this afternoon, and I am proud that our Scottish Parliament is marking the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau in this way. We have heard a lot of members this afternoon, quite rightly, offering their recollections of visits to the Nazi death camps, and I would wish to put on record my own. I was 21 years old when I visited Auschwitz-Birkenau. I had been studying in Bologna at the Johns Hopkins University's International Studies Centre there and took up the opportunity of a summer school exchange with the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Part of the programme involved a visit to Auschwitz, and while some of my fellow students declined to go as they felt it would be too upsetting, for my part, I considered it my duty to go and to bear witness. And, Presiding Officer, it was not just the hugely cynical message at the entrance gate, Arbeit macht frei, that saddened me so, and it was not just the mountain of shoes, nor the countless photographs of the young twins that adorned an entire wall, their faces full of hope as they had yet to meet the butcher Mengele. It was not just that that caught so at my soul, but, Presiding Officer, what broke my heart was in fact standing at the end of the rail track in Birkenau as a young European woman in the early 1980s trying to get my head around how it could be that only 40 short years previously you could get on a train in Paris or Brussels or any other modern civilized European city and end up in hell. That experience has stayed with me all my life and has informed my approach to my fellow man, my choice of the law as a career to ensure that people's rights are respected, and it has also informed the objectives of my political life. For as has been said by Scotland's First Minister and others, the industrial killing machine that Germany became did not start at the end of that train track in Birkenau. It started with the othering of the Jews, with the incremental denuding of Jews of their rights, with the normalisation of anti-Semitism and bigotry and hatred, and with non-Jews and the international community, it has to be said, failing in the main part to speak out when all that was happening. And that is why it is vital that we all of us, each of us, remain vigilant, that we challenge anti-Semitism, that we challenge bigotry, that we challenge hatred, wherever they are promoted. That is our duty as parliamentarians, and it is our duty as citizens. And we must discharge that duty and encourage the generations to come always to bear witness. In working on this speech this afternoon, Presiding Officer, I was struck very much by an historic moment that took place last week, and that was when the German President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, became the first German president ever to give a speech at Yad Vashem. And that, of course, was on an event to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And in a very moving speech, the German president said, and I quote, "The eternal flame at Yad Vashem does not go out. Germany's responsibility does not expire." And he went on to say, and with considerable candour and honesty, and I quote, "I wish I could say that we Germans have learnt from history once and for all, but I cannot say that when hatred is spreading." Presiding Officer, we should all be prepared to exercise, I believe, the same candour because, of course, as has been recognised in this debate this afternoon, hatred is spreading and it is up to each one of us to do what we can in the face of such development in our society here, in Europe and across the world. In the last few days, we have heard stories of such bravery and such endurance in the face of barbarism and obscenity, such stories on the part of individual survivors who were determined following their liberation not to be victims, but to live their lives to the full and to make their contribution. And it is perhaps fitting, Presiding Officer, given our imminent departure and I would say sad departure from the European Union, to reference here a remarkable woman, Simone Veil. Simone Veil was the first president of the first directly elected European Parliament, those elections held in 1979. Simone Veil, in fact, bore the stamp of her Auschwitz number on her arm, but she was determined to make her mark on the life of her country, France, and she was very attuned, of course, indeed, to the founding purpose of the European project. I bear witness, Presiding Officer.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Daniel Johnson for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Last night, I was proud to sponsor Parliament's Holocaust Memorial Day event along with my colleague Ian Gray. What struck me was the sense of people coming together, not just as an act of observation, but one of participation and shared responsibility. We were privileged to be joined by Janine Webber, somebody who other people have referenced, a Holocaust survivor. She told her remarkable story, how she survived through the resilience of family members, twists of fate, rare acts of defiance of others, and above all, although she would not say it herself, her own personal strength. But what struck me was her age as she lived through those experiences. Born in 1933, she was 7 when her father was shot by the Nazis within her own earshot. She told us of witnessing her mother's death from typhoid in a damp, rat-infested basement in the ghetto when she was 9. At 10, her brother was shot in front of her by a member of the SS. She showed us photos of her and her brother taken before the war, looking at those two children, the same age as my daughters. I listened to the 87-year-old woman, but I thought of that 7-year-old girl. As a father, what I felt was anguish and horror that a child so young should have to experience those things. What I want to speak about is the need for us all to carry forward the memory of Auschwitz and the Holocaust. In the 75th year of the liberation of this most infamous of Nazi death camps, many are commenting rightly on the significance of these years as direct witness of these events is slowly lost. It is therefore incumbent on each of us to consider what the Holocaust means to us, to share the experience, not just the facts, and to learn and act on those lessons. An important recent influence on my thinking was a book that I read, East-West Street. It is one man's exploration of his own family's experience of the Holocaust. And the main reason this book made an impression on me was the story it told of everyday people and how the Nazi persecution and extermination of Jewish people unfolded. It tells of the lives of shopkeepers and lawyers and farmhands, of aunties, grandparents, of daughters and of sons, lives like anybody's, lives like ours. And the Holocaust did not happen to them in a single action or event. It was a number of small, sometimes subtle steps, municipal edicts, regulatory changes, government requirements, mandated actions. And these were enabled not by an initial overriding hatred, but by casual prejudice, careless othering, self-interested inaction of those who chose to look the other way. That's how it starts. That's how it takes hold. And that is why we must be so wary of the insidious rise of anti-Semitism that we currently experience. And what I feel I must say as a Labour Party member and elected representative, that I think this is a particularly important point for me to state. The Labour Party is supposed to be the party of equality, of social justice and of human rights. But in recent months and years, we have failed. And in particular, we have failed the Jewish people. Following these events, I made it a personal point to reach out, to discuss, to listen to the Jewish community in Edinburgh. I felt I needed to take direct personal steps. And I have been struck by the pain, the hurt, and the fear our actions and inactions have caused. Our failure to deal with complaints, our readmission of members guilty of anti-Semitism, our reluctance to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. In my 25 years of being a Labour Party member, there are things that the party has done I've disagreed with. There are things that the party has done that have made me angry. But these events and these conversations that I have held are the first time in all those years I have ever felt ashamed to be a Labour Party member. Now, I'm in no doubt that these challenges are unique to the Labour Party. They are challenges we all face. But I want the Labour Party to hold itself to a higher standard. I want it to be the party of justice and of human rights. So Labour must put an end to this and must never let these issues arise again. As the party responsible for enshrining so many of our rights and pursuing equality, we have a responsibility to put this right, and I know that we will. These events have also convinced me that we must take personal responsibility to carry on the lessons of the Holocaust, to tackle anti-Semitism and prejudice. We cannot allow the actions of the Nazis to be something that happened to other people. These are things that happen to people, people like me, people like you, people like all of us. These acts were crimes against humanity, crimes against us all. We must strive not just to memorize the facts of the Holocaust, but to share and pass on the feelings, the human experience of those who survived and those who fell victim. And to truly learn lessons, it is not enough to simply say the right things. We must take the right actions. We must call out intolerant behaviours. We must challenge casual prejudice. We must take action against the powerful when they seek to oppress the minority. These are my personal lessons from what was experienced those 75 years ago. Thank you.
Paul Adam Tompkins, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many members have rightly said that it's a privilege to speak in this debate, but Mr Johnson, if I may say so, it's a particular privilege to follow that speech, which was courageous, brave and right. At time for reflection today, Presiding Officer, Stephen Stone from St Roch's School in my city of Glasgow talked eloquently about Holocaust teaching and Holocaust education in contemporary Scottish schools, and I want to return to that at the end of my speech this afternoon, but I want to open with some reflections of my own time in school in England in the 1980s. I went to an ordinary state comprehensive school in Dorset, but it was a school which at that time was led by an extraordinary teacher whose name was John Webster. And at my school, history was compulsory for all students, all pupils in the school alongside maths and English. And we knew that this was unusual, and we didn't know quite why history was compulsory in our school, but we did know that it had something to do with Mr. Webster, the head teacher. It was only when I read his obituaries about 3 years ago that I began to understand why. In 1945, on His Majesty's service, my head teacher, Mr. Webster, was a young man in uniform at the end of a long war, like those young men that Edward Manton described a few moments ago. And he was one of the very first Allied soldiers to walk into the death camp that his unit had discovered. And he saw with his own eyes the horrors that we all think we understand. And he resolved there and then that he would do all he could to ensure that those who met thereafter would never forget. And at school, I was blessed with remarkable and brilliant history teachers whose work was placed front and centre in our curriculum for reasons I never understood as a child, but for which I will always be grateful. Presiding Officer, I've used this quotation before, but I make no apology for repeating it. With the absurd precision to which we later had to accustom ourselves, the Germans held the roll call. At the end, the officer asked, "Wie viel Stück?" The corporal saluted smartly and replied that there were 650 pieces and that all was in order. They then loaded us onto the buses and took us to the station. And here the train was waiting for us. Here we received the first blows. And it was so new and so senseless that we felt no pain, neither in body nor in spirit, only a profound amazement. For how can one hit a man without anger? There were 12 goods wagons for 650 men. In mine, we were only 45, but it was a small wagon. Here then, before our very eyes, under our very feet, was one of those notorious transport trains, those which never return and of which, shuddering and always a little incredulous, we had so often heard speak. Exactly like this, detail for detail, goods wagons, closed from the outside with men, women, and children pressed together without pity, like cheap merchandise for a journey towards nothingness, a journey down there towards the bottom. And this time, it's us who are inside. These words are from the opening chapter of Primo Levi's autobiographical account of the Holocaust, If This Is a Man. And in the middle of that passage, Levi asks a hauntingly simple question. How can one hit a man without anger? The Holocaust happened because not very long ago, in the heart of Europe, it was the policy of the government of what had been a leading European civilization to eliminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth. Yet the Nazis were not angry with the Jews. The brutality and the beatings, the murder and the killing did not happen because anyone had cause to be angry. They happened because of cold, calculated hatred, baseless hatred, as Bill Kidd called it a few moments ago. And that, I think, is what must be remembered. That is what my head teacher, Mr. Webster, wanted us to learn through the study of history, that hatred is such a venal emotion that it can cause, as Alec Cole Hamilton reflected, it can cause perfectly ordinary people to commit vast and extraordinary crimes on an industrial scale. And the Cabinet Secretary reflected on this, I think, in her opening remarks, that we are not born to hate. Hatred is something which we learn. And we, all of us here now, cannot be complacent and must have the courage, as Mr. Johnson has shown, to call out hatred and prejudice wherever we see it, because peace and progress and tolerance, as the Cabinet Secretary said, cannot be taken for granted. Not here, not now, not anywhere. Those who were sent to the death camps, Presiding Officer, lost their possessions, their loved ones, their family members, their clothes, their shoes, even their hair. They were deformed by starvation. They were enslaved in hard labor. They were tattooed with a number. They lost their names, their identities. They were stripped naked in the snow and ice with nothing but their own arms to warm them, alone in huge numbers. This was mass, systemic, organized murder on an unprecedented scale. At Auschwitz, about which we've heard so much, in August 1944, 24,000 people were murdered in a single day. And those people were not prisoners of war. The war had nothing to do with it. They were just people that a government wanted to annihilate because that government hated Jews. I've never been to Auschwitz, Presiding Officer, but I have been to Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is Israel's Holocaust museum on the western slopes of Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. And Yad Vashem is a phrase taken from the book of Isaiah, and it means a place and a name. And it is a place of remembrance where the names of those who were murdered by the Nazis are recorded and where their memories are honoured. And it is at once a place of calm dignity, as Ruth Davidson said, and outraged defiance. I haven't been to Auschwitz, presiding officer, because one day when they're old enough, I'm going to take my children there. My children are Jewish. They have all attended, or in the case of two of them, they still are attending, Scotland's only Jewish primary school, the superb Calderwood Lodge, which shares a campus now with a Roman Catholic school. And we think that it may be the only joint Jewish Catholic primary school campus anywhere in the world. It's a very special place. Like St Roch's in Glasgow, about which we heard, at Time for Reflection, Calderwood Lodge takes Holocaust teaching seriously. Every year, Primary 7 pupils from Calderwood Lodge go to Amsterdam for a few days, where they visit the Anne Frank Museum and learn firsthand at the feet of Holocaust survivors. No matter how much you think you know, this is my last remark, presiding officer, no matter how much you think you know about the Holocaust and the suffering of the Jewish people, you realize within a few minutes of being at a place like Auschwitz or Yad Vashem that you will only ever be able to scratch the surface of the unimaginable pain it caused. And of course, the resolution that burns throughout all of us as we walk through these places, as we bear witness, as we think and reflect, is never again. As you leave Yad Vashem, you see carved into a huge stone archway the words of Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 14. I will put my breath into you, and you shall live again, and I will set you upon your own soil. Amen to that.
I now call Eileen Campbell to close this debate. If you could take us to 5 o'clock, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And this debate has been remarkable. Every speaker and every contribution powerful and impactful. And regardless of political party, we unite to stand here today in solidarity against bigotry and intolerance, recognising the inhumane violence it can cause if it's left unchallenged. But it's been a debate that has enabled us not to just offer mealy-mouthed messages of never forgetting, but to resolve to be actively anti-racist, anti-fascist, to unite as political leaders to not just speak out against hate, but instead use our privileged positions to influence, to agitate for positive change, and to back up our words with deeds and actions. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day, Stand Together, helps us all to focus on what we can do and what we must do to prevent these atrocities from happening again. And although it is the responsibility of every individual, as Pauline McNeill rightly pointed out, it is especially significant for those of us who are leaders and who are politicians. We have the privilege of being in positions where our actions and our words can have influence. This debate has shown that we have here in this Parliament chosen to use those positions to collectively help shape the inclusive and welcoming society we want to live in, that we want our children to grow up in and to reject hate. But the debate has also revealed the ultimate price if a blind eye is turned to politicians or political leaders whose actions create fear, legitimise oppression and othering, or breed hatred and contempt. That fear is seen all too often with, as Ross Greer and others have pointed out, as a continued festering anti-Semitism in too many countries and communities here and around the world. Of the worrying and increasing confidence of fascists due to the increasing legitimacy that some political discourse has created. Of course, commemoration should not just be about remembering the past, but act as a lesson for generations to come about the need to confront prejudice and hatred. We must work together in our communities, nationally and internationally, to promote understanding, recognise diversity and to challenge discrimination. To ensure that the burden of bearing witness that Ian Gray described, that is often demanded of survivors who have to relive their horror, is heeded and does bring about the positive change we seek. It is the very least that they can expect, and it's the very least that they deserve. The horrific roll call of genocide and mass annihilation of those based on ethnicity that followed the Holocaust serves to show just how much work is yet to be done. Ruth Davidson described how the world failed in its obligation to take responsibility for the protection of others that so many had fought for. And Ian Gray and Kenneth Gibson described the failures of the UN in the protection of those facing persecution. But the debate has also rightly discussed the banality of evil. Much of what we remember this week is not just the actions of political leaders or troops, but also the banality of that evil. Alec Cole-Hamilton described the terrifying acts that can be done by humdrum men. The false reassurances, as described by Tom Arthur, offered to those entering Auschwitz and other camps by troops facilitating their murder. And Kenny Gibson reminded us that it was architects that designed the death camps, educated people. That education that we often cherish has been a protective factor against racism and hatred, but not in this case. The banality of evil, an unfortunately perfect summation of what we mark and what we remember today. All of these themes that we have discussed today, in terms of how we remember the past, how we honour those who died, how we heed the words of those that survived, and how we work for a better world, all pointed to the importance of the work of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and the Holocaust Educational Trust. We remain committed to supporting learning about the Holocaust in line with the values of the Curriculum for Excellence, with compassion at its core. And we continue to support the Holocaust Education Trust Lessons from Auschwitz programme, as we have done for the past 10 years. The Holocaust Education Trust do excellent work and have been rightly singled out by members during this debate. Seeing the work they do firsthand and the impact and reach of this is crucial and ever more important. It's not easy work. It is tackling an issue with young people that is horrifying and distressing, and that confrontation of that inhumanity is painful. But the young people who have participated in the programme become Holocaust ambassadors to then share their experience and reflections with fellow pupils, and I'm attending an event at Lanark Grammar this week. And as the lived memory of the Holocaust fades, it becomes crucial that we continue to ensure each and every generation to come continues to understand and reflect on the culmination of oppression, of hate, othering, racism and fascism, and instill within our young people the desire to want something different. A world that is open-minded, peaceful, loving and kind, a fitting legacy for those who we saw bear witness yesterday, possibly for the last time, to ensure that they are reassured that we will not forget, turn a blind eye or walk on the other side. Ross Greer's message to never stop educating is one that I know we can all agree with. And although Scotland is an open and inclusive nation, as too many have described and as too many colleagues have experienced, we are unfortunately not immune from hateful behaviour or prejudicial attitudes. While I was glad to, along with Hamza Yousaf, announce the other day the £500,000 for the Places of Worship Fund, Anas Sarwar is absolutely right. It is something that I wish I didn't have to do. But faith communities need to feel that their government, from their government, that we support them and that we've listened to them and that we cherish them. We can never be complacent about anti-Semitism or any form of prejudice or discrimination. We have still to do a lot to create a truly welcoming and inclusive society that promotes equality and human rights. How we use the lessons of Auschwitz to guide our approach to the way we look after and support refugees, how we recognise the consequences of global political conflict and the need for us to provide sanctuary to those fleeing persecution as a result. We must keep at the forefront of our minds that hatred and prejudice don't happen in a vacuum. They are driven by people who deliberately turn communities against each other. Holocaust Memorial Day in Scotland provides an opportunity to learn from the past and encourage us to work together to tackle hatred and prejudice so that we can create a stronger, more inclusive future for everyone. And just as Daniel Johnson emotionally addressed the challenges felt in his party and his message to his colleagues to have his party held to a higher standard, perhaps given this coming together and of Anas Sarwar talking about the things that unite us and don't separate us, then perhaps we should all treat each other a bit better and collectively ensure that our Parliament is held to a higher standard to show politics can be better and politics here in Scotland can be kinder. Our commitment to promoting and supporting Holocaust Memorial Day demonstrates our collective resolve to stand in solidarity with victims of genocide and other terrible human rights abuses around the world. We must keep the memory of such genocides alive and never forget the consequences of bigotry and intolerance. By keeping memories and stories alive, honours those who have suffered. It is a vital reminder of the consequences of unchecked prejudice and that our vision of an inclusive society should never be taken for granted. and it's an important spur to action. It should encourage us to do everything in our power to stand together, to challenge prejudice, tackle discrimination and celebrate diversity, because ultimately that's the best possible tribute we can pay to those we are remembering today. The spirit of Plato, John Stuart Mills and Burns has been evoked today, wise men that we must also heed. I'm certainly proud that our national hero, our national bard, is not a man of war, but of poetry and of prose that espouse the messages of love and kindness. And I can think of no better tribute to those that have survived the Holocaust and those that didn't. We pay tribute to their memory by ensuring that we can build a country with that at the hallmark of how we want to create a better future. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's taken part in this debate.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate. Yes, point of order, Mike Rumbles.
I want to raise a point of order under Rule 811, Business Motion, subparagraph 3. I believe that in the unprecedented situation, as I understand it, MSPs will be asked in a few moments to vote to direct the corporate body to do something it has unanimously already decided not to do. Our corporate body makes non-partisan decisions on all of our behalf. Do you, Presiding Officer, believe that enough time was given to put down amendments to the business motion, given that only 2 hours were allowed for this? And I do understand the difficulties the parliamentary authorities, including yourself, would have been under due to the short notice of the motion. If more time had been given, members could have put down amendments so that more than just 2 members could be called by you to speak in the business motion.
Can I thank Mr Rumbles for the point of order? Mr Rumbles is right. Under standing orders, only one person may speak against the business motion and for the government minister to respond. We have actually relaxed that rule for the forward planning motion on a Wednesday to allow more members to speak. The key point here is that the motion tonight is arranging for the business for the week, and it is unusual to change the business itself at such short notice. However, there will be time in the debate tomorrow, so the business motion is simply arranging time for the subject itself to be debated, and the business motion proposes putting half an hour aside tomorrow to be able to debate this particular subject. There will be time, there's only time for one member from each party to contribute tomorrow. However, as is usually the case, members can make an intervention. In fact, members can actually make interventions on the business motion too when that is moved. And I hope that explains the standing orders on this subject matter. So moving on to the next item of business, which is the business motion Mr Rumbles referred to, number 20624, in the name of Graham Day, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out revisions to this week's business. Could I call on Mr Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now, I believe Maurice Golden would like to speak against this motion. Mr Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to speak against this business motion on the basis that between now and June, we have to accommodate 6 committee debates, 9 opposition business days, 8 stage 1 debates, 13 stage 3 debates. Next week, we will be voting until 7 o'clock in the evening, and indeed on Wednesday, that might even be later. Happy to take an intervention.
Intervention from Eileen Smith.
I thank Mr Golden for taking the intervention. So on that point, I wonder, would he agree with me that parliamentary time is scarce and consequently it ought to be allocated to Scotland's priorities, such as our health service and our children's schools? And mindful of that, Presiding Officer, I am though pleased that the Minister for Parliamentary Business and the Bureau has agreed to extend on Thursday the drugs debate by 30 minutes and thus in doing so move the European flag debate to tomorrow. Due to this, Scottish Labour would intend to abstain on the business motion this evening rather than vote against. However, we also accept the explanation given by the SPCB on the flag issue. I thank the member for taking the intervention.
Maurice Golden.
I thank the member for her comments, and clearly some of the SNP members might want to make some representation to their business manager on extending parliamentary time, perhaps to accommodate a statement on Scotland's crumbling police stations, which have ultimately been unfortunately ruled out in order to accommodate the debate on flags tomorrow. But I do thank both Labour and the Liberal Democrats for supporting the statement on Scotland's crumbling police stations.
Willie Rennie. The member will know that I'm a strong pro-European, but I am a strong pro-European and will always be a strong pro-European. But I respect the decision of the corporate body and, more importantly, the independence of the corporate body. Is he as disappointed as I am that the government can find time to debate flags, yet not 1 minute can be found to debate the performance of our education system or the state of Scotland's police service?
Maurice Golden.
I thank the member for his contribution. I know he is a committed European, and I find it incredibly worrying and disappointing that members of the SNP seek to barrack and bully and boo respected members of this Parliament who support the European values. I'm also incredibly disappointed that the SNP, aided and abetted by the Greens, see flying flags as more important than improving Scotland's public services. And I urge members to vote against the business motion.
Can I call the business manager? Graham Deed to respond on behalf of the government?
Presiding Officer, none of the parties represented in the Bureau would have wanted to be in this situation. The two parties, the SNP and Greens, who supported the scheduling of the debate at issue, did so with a heavy heart, having made concerted efforts over the last 2 weeks to seek a compromise following the original decision by the corporate body to take down the flag that represents both the Council of Europe and European Union, outside this Parliament on Friday. This matter was discussed in detail at last Tuesday's Bureau, and resulting from that, the corporate body was requested to meet again and consider the matter further. They did so, but by majority decided to stand by their original decision. On Friday, on behalf of the Scottish Government, I wrote to the corporate body suggesting a compromise which would have seen the European flag stay up through transition and the corporate body able to review the policy on flags over that period. I understand the Green Party similarly communicated their thoughts on seeking a way forward which would have averted the matter coming to the Chamber. Unfortunately, they could not agree to revisit their decision. While the corporate body is rightly non-political, there is no decision they could take on this matter to wave the flag up or take it down, which could not be seen as political, and therefore it is surely right that the Parliament as a whole makes the decision. Presiding Officer, speaking on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau tonight as I am, I do not intend to get into the detail of the stances which the parties represented on the Bureau have adopted on this matter. Those will, I am sure, become apparent during the 30-minute debate which this motion seeks to schedule for tomorrow. But I would stress one thing. The interactions between the corporate body, the Bureau, and those parties opposed to the decision which was reached have at all times been respectful, recognising that the corporate body acted in good faith and that those who hold an alternative view have sought genuinely to secure a compromise. I hope, perhaps forlornly, tomorrow's debate can be conducted in a similar vein. Finally, Presiding Officer, this motion, in addition to scheduling the short debate at issue, as Eileen Smith noted, extends the time allocated for the debate on drugs and alcohol on Thursday. This was a very reasonable request by Labour, which the Government and the Bureau was happy to support. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So the question is that motion 20624 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20624 in the name of Graham Day is yes 62, no 30. There were 17 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. I'm going to turn now to decision time. And there's only one question today. The question is that motion 20603 in the name of Eileen Campbell on Holocaust Memorial Day 2020 75th anniversary be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. And we are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Sandra White on Alistair Gray, a creative force. We'll just have a short moment's pause while members and the Minister change seats. Just a pause.